Good morning. I am Dr. Duncan Pelly. I am an associate professor of entrepreneurship at McMurray University, and I'm going to tell you a story called Sadism, Foreign Lands, the Burn Pit Atrocity. This is a story that, quite frankly, makes me very sad. Before I launch into this paper, I'm going to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I decided to write this paper and why it's becoming more and more germane. I'll tell you about the burn pits as a type of heterotopia. I'll provide a quick primer on sadism. I'll introduce the methodology, and I'll give 3 examples of Sadean dysfunctions in the military before we open it up for questions and comments. You know, I'm writing this paper and I'm doing this presentation because I'm mad. I'm mad, I'm angry, I'm livid, I'm pissed off. If you look in the thesaurus, there's not enough words to describe just how frustrating this is. And this picture is a man named Brian Alvarado. He was the inspiration to write this paper. Now, Brian was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, and I deployed to Iraq at roughly the same time. We're roughly the same age, and we both came from Southern California. Brian was once a healthy, strapping young man of about 160 pounds, looking very healthy here. Iraq, this is what he looks like, barely able to tip the scales at 100 pounds. A man who has had a tracheotomy because he can't breathe. His body is infected with an alphabet of diseases. Some of them have been diagnosed, others have not. He can no longer consume food except through a special bag that injects kind of like baby food all directly into his stomach. He can barely speak, he can barely move because he's lost all of his strength. This is what's happened to Brian Alvarado. And the question I'm sure that you're asking is, how did this happen? Well, it happened because of this. This is a burn pit. Burn pits were large pits that were dug directly in the ground during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were used to dispose of all sorts of things that you can throw away and things you can't throw away. This includes medical waste. This includes rubber, chemicals, pulverized glass, tanks, they used jet engine as an accelerant to these burn pits. And unfortunately, burn pits were frequently co-located with both human habitation and places where service members worked. I, like Brian Alvarado, was exposed to the burn pits, and it has been called the Agent Orange of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars. It is something that has caused a tremendous amount of disability. In fact, I was reading one medical survey that I cite in this paper that 42% of individuals exposed to burn pits have complained about having difficulty walking 10 steps. So this is something that's very significant. Now, the thing that made me so mad and made me write this paper is Brian Alvarado and several other defendants and several other former service members got together with lawyers and attempted to sue government contractors for using these burn pits and for locating them where human habitation occurred. And judges have continuously, time and time again, thrown out these lawsuits saying that contractors were not to blame. And so I sat there and I asked myself, well, maybe the judge is right. I don't know. Are contractors not solely to blame? I actually put the finger right back on the military. And I use the lens of sadism to explore kind of how the military is responsible for this. So let me tell you just a little bit about sadism first, or Marquis de Sade, rather. Now, we won't talk about sadism in the sense of sadomasochism that some of you may be familiar with or may have heard of in popular media, but we're looking at the original ideas of Marquis de Sade, Donatien Alphonse Francois, as he's otherwise known. This is a philosophy that is a coherent system of ethics, but it is one that is anti-liberal, anti-humanist, anti-democratic, and anti-women. It relishes in the inequality between classes and genders, and it postulates that whenever someone has power, then they have the right to do whatever they want to those under them. Now, in contrast to de Sade, who mostly describes sexual exploitation, we're going to be talking about economic and class-based exploitation that de Sade also talks about in this particular paper. Before I give you some of the vignettes of the paper, let me tell you just a little bit about the particular methodology that I've used, the Sadean autoethnography. So I've used autoethnography because I am describing my own experiences, and I've combined these experiences with interviews of people that I deployed with, as well as some secondhand sources that have been scientific studies that have been made available to the public regarding burn pit exposure. Now, because of the fact that I am looking at members of the military industrial complex, many of them who were still in government, and many of them were very powerful. I needed to provide a degree of anonymity to protect both myself and the informants. And so I borrowed a device, a literary device from Marquis de Sade, and I use a lot of archetypes in my paper. So when I describe like a kernel, it's meant to describe kernels in general, not any specific kernel. Just like how Marquis de Sade might use the term duke to describe all members of the aristocracy, not a particular duke. I also borrowed another writing technique from de Sade, and I chop up the action into brief tableaux or brief vignettes to kind of keep the reader uh, interested and engaged in the text. So this paper has storytelling vignettes, which are given titles in italics, and they're given theoretical vignettes with titles in bold. And that, much like Assad, I am using kind of the story and using to abstract um, the vignettes of this paper to broader theoretical findings on, for example, power relations. Another thing that I have drawn from Marquis de Sade is every single one of his books requires this separate space or heterotopia. He needed a brothel, a dungeon, isolated monastery in order to perpetuate his atrocities. And what I'm arguing is that the burn pit and its surrounding areas in a war zone is also much like this heterotopia. It is an isolated space. Now, de Sade never used the term heterotopia, but I am here. And a heterotopia is kind of a bubble that inhabits space and place simultaneously or is devoid of space and place, depending on the way that you want to look at it. In a lot of organizations, we see heterotopias such as adhocracies, holographic organizations, and task forces. But it's one that has kind of a separate system of norms that is coherent with itself, but is generally not seen to be coherent with broader societal trends. Time in a 15-minute presentation to summarize all of the vignettes, but I would like to summarize some of them for you here. And what we basically are looking at are three different Sadean uh, dysfunctions, I'm calling them. So the first one on the left, let's say it's a man who looks kind of overweight and he looks in the mirror and he sees himself looking kind of thin. Well, this is designed to represent de Sade's insistence on pomp and circumstance at all times, irrespective of whether it had any benefit to anybody but himself. And this vignette came about because of the fact that our own battalion commander, our colonel, was obsessed with pomp and circumstance at all times. And one example of this was the fact that we had to salute officers in a war zone, which is normally not something that you do because it identifies you to enemy snipers, but we saluted. And the joke in our unit was we were at war and then a garrison broke out. We acted like we were in a peacetime environment even though we were in the middle of a war zone. And this, of course, escalates to a point. When you work in a military facility, especially in a deployment, there could be explosions, especially when we were dealing with detainees. So you need to have eye protection on all times, and that could be sunglasses with light or dark lenses. Well, our particular commander was wearing eyeglasses, and he forgot his light and dark lenses, and the gate guards that technically worked for him refused to let him onto the compound. Now, fortunately, one of his deputies had a pair of glasses that they were loaning him so he could get his glasses in his office. And what he did immediately after that is he more or less made it a point to punish those people who would call him out for not adhering to his own policies. And how did he do that? Well, you have to imagine guards who are standing outside for 12-hour shifts a day right next to a burn pit. They're going to get sick. A lot of them started to feel nauseous. They started to feel ill. They knew that something was wrong with this burn pit. And so some of them started wearing the face masks like we see during COVID, and some of them just outright wore gas masks. Well, the colonel was livid. What he wound up doing is saying that because these individuals were the face of the military, they needed to look like soldiers at all times. So he forbade them from wearing face masks and gas masks, um, which was unfortunate. It was basically putting him in direct exposure. But this was kind of like a Marquis de Sade's revenge orgasm. And that's kind of what I believe that he was doing. His behavior is consistent with that. And I talk about that more in the vignettes. A second Sadean fetish is corpophagia, or in other words, making people eat their own waste. And we had the same kind of a problem. We had a first sergeant in our unit whose nickname was First Sergeant Pea Drinker, and he was called that because of the fact that he drank his own urine every morning when he got up from bed because evidently it made him strong like a Roman warrior, and he tried to make service members do the same. So we were sitting in the office one day, and First Sergeant Pea Drinker decided that everybody in the unit needed to run a physical fitness test around the burn pit as a way to normalize this. this particular feature. And of course, I protested in the meeting, and several other people protested, and we were severely reprimanded, and we were threatened by our chain of command. So needless to say, what we did is we ran our physical fitness test the next day around the burn pit. It was about a mile around the burn pit. We did our push-ups and sit-ups around the burn pit as well. So 2 miles around the burn pit, and then push-ups and sit-ups for 2 minutes. And I remember that there was charred flakes about the size of paper coming down. I remember my lungs were burning. I remember people were vomiting afterwards. But I made it through. I passed the physical fitness test. And I noticed that the next day, when I was in the shower, I was coughing up every color of the rainbow. It was literally a Pablo Picasso or a Van Gogh painting at my feet every single morning. I didn't know that the human body could expectorate such kinds of colors, and I attribute that to the burn pit. And that happened for about 2 weeks, and I was pretty much one of the lucky ones. People in my unit have, some of them can't swim, they can't exercise, they have no cardiovascular capability anymore because quite frankly, they can't breathe. Other people got pulverized glass in their lungs from that day, so that they have severe nosebleeds because the pulverized glass evaporated and it got into their sinus passages. So I'm one of the lucky ones. But it was this obsession with forcing other people to consume someone else's waste. That's another form of Sade. And then this last one we have is actually from the French Revolution, and this is a degree of classism that I wanted to illustrate. Um, Marquis de Sade was always obsessed with the fact that as an aristocrat, he had special privileges and he could make people do whatever he wanted. Well, in our particular unit, the lower enlisted, the younger soldiers, had encountered extra impact from the burn pits, whereas senior members of staff did not. And one of the best ways that I can illustrate this is, you may know this, but if you have a problem with any government employee, you can write to a congressman, you can write to a president. In fact, you can write to any elected official that represents you, and you can request an investigation into whatever it is. And this could be complaining about the post office or whatever. But we had lots and lots and lots of people in our unit complaining about the burn pit, complaining about how it made them sick, complaining about all these things. And every time our colonels so casually dismissed it with, well, I live and walk next to the burn pit every single day and I feel fine. Indicating that someone who works in an air-conditioned office with state-of-the-art filters is enduring the same level of danger as is someone who, for example, is sitting on, a guard mount 12 to 14 hours a day with no face protection, no face mask, no breathing apparatus for 6 days a week for an entire year. They were the ones getting sick, and yet they had to continue to endure the brunt of it. Here, I'm not confirming or denying that this was our unit. Well, the unit that I'm describing in the paper, again, because we're trying a little bit of anonymity, but this was the unit that I deployed with, if you're curious. There's a picture of me right there. And I chose this picture from our unit not to say that these are the people that I'm describing in the particular story, because that's not what I'm doing. Again, some anonymity, a la de Sade. But what I did want you all to look at is look at this picture of these individuals and think about just looking at the statistics of people that deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, knowing that most of them are sick and permanently debilitated from what happened here. So that's just kind of a little bit of a snapshot to help you think about that.